Hello, my name is Thea Newman and I am the director of Solaravus. In this video, I'd like to describe to you a framework that I've been developing to help inform an individual's decision whether or not to accept or decline the COVID-19 vaccine. Some important preliminary statements. I am a biophysicist. I've been doing research for over 25 years. And for 10 of those I was involved in managing other researchers. I am not a medical doctor and I am not giving medical advice. This presentation is designed to give perspectives on decision-making regarding the COVID vaccine. Each individual's circumstances are unique, and their decision to accept or decline the vaccine must take into account their personal factors. These decisions ultimately rest with each individual in collaboration with their doctor and health provider. Medical decisions are normally based on a risk-benefit analysis for a given individual. Let's do a quick review of that in relationship to COVID-19. A risk-benefit analysis is like a sort of balance. If the benefit clearly outweighs the risk, then you would accept the medical treatment. For example, if your risk was that you would die of a heart attack because you have advanced heart disease, then you would accept a well-tested surgery to correct that condition because the benefit would be many more years of life with a relatively small risk of not surviving the operation. On the other hand, if the risk outweighs the benefit, then we would decline the medical treatment. For example, if you had no known symptoms of heart disease, but perhaps you had a family history of heart disease, and the doctor was suggesting that you have a completely new surgical procedure that had never before been tested on humans, you would decline that medical intervention. The benefits are not obvious and the risk seems quite large. So we can think of risk and benefit in terms of this kind of balance. Now, in terms of the COVID vaccine, what are the benefits and what are the risks? At the individual level, what we're really thinking about is a benefit which is a significant reduction in the chance of death or serious illness from COVID. The risk, as with any medical intervention or vaccine, is a chance of severe short and or long-term side effects from having the vaccine or the medical treatment. Now, for COVID-19, the benefit is mitigating against severe outcomes which themselves depend very, very strongly on age and health status. And we'll talk more about that shortly. The risk is somewhat quantifiable for short-term side effects and appears to be very small, at least for very serious risks from the vaccine. However, for longer-term side effects, the risk is necessarily much less clear. The COVID vaccine has not existed for more than a year, and we simply haven't had the time to do long-term studies on side effects. This is particularly important because some of the vaccines use quite new technology, the so-called mRNA technology. Therefore, we don't have such a strong historical basis in which to understand longer-term side effects. So because of these deficiencies with actual quantifiable risk with the input data, it will be difficult for some individuals to make a decision based on this balance. Now, in situations where it's hard to make quantitatively based decisions, instead we can do what's called a qualitative analysis. And this is to try and make decisions based on more broad categories than simply just numerical values. And we do this all the time in life. When you're crossing the road, you're really doing a qualitative analysis whether it's safe to cross. You're not measuring the speed of oncoming cars and so on. So the vaccine decision cube, as I call it, is a framework that is qualitative in nature to help an individual reach a decision or inform that decision based on the benefits and risks of the COVID-19 vaccine. And now let me take you through this framework for qualitative reasoning, which I call the vaccine decision cube. So here is a picture of a cube. And you can see I've got 3 bolder lines there, and those are going to be 3 directions which will inform our decision. The first is age. And the reason for this is that the risk of death from COVID is well known and well documented to rise exponentially with age. For those of you who are not so familiar with this term exponential, it essentially means that there are orders of magnitude difference in the risk with age. And for example, these numbers are approximately correct. Young children would have a roughly 1 in 100,000 chance on average from dying from COVID, whereas adults in their mid-40s would have 100 times greater risk, about 1 in 1,000. And for adults over 80, they would be at severe risk of death from COVID-19, approximately 1 in 10. So age is the most important variable to understand risk of death or severe outcomes from COVID. Now, on this axis of the cube that's sort of going into the page or going into the screen, I have something I called illness, and this is really the opposite of health. Chronic poor health. That's an axis because risk of hospitalization and or death from COVID is well documented to be strongly dependent on particular forms of chronic illness. You often hear of these talked about as comorbidities. The forms of chronic health that are known to be very relevant here would be things like hypertension, that's high blood pressure, diabetes, forms of lung disease like COPD, heart disease, and also more generally obesity. Now, the vertical axis of this cube may look a bit strange at first, but it's actually something I'm calling trust. If you do not have a free society, it doesn't matter what individuals think. You simply vaccinate them all as if they were sheep on a farm. If you have a free society, then each individual needs to make a decision whether or not they want to accept a medical intervention such as a vaccine. And for that individual to make a decision, their decision will be based partly on how much they trust the information they're receiving. So trust is actually a very important variable, as important as age and health status, in how an individual reaches their decision. So what is an individual's level of trust and confidence in the competence and the trustworthiness, the integrity of the sources of information? They will be getting information from government, from the news, maybe their doctor or health systems, from academics in universities, from major corporations like drug companies, and so on and so forth. Now, along each of these axes, we can have values that range from low through medium to high. And our categories for each of them are going to be simply low, medium, and high, and that's sort of the qualitative aspect of this framework. Now, for each individual, they will have some age score, some illness score, and some trust score. And one algorithm, really the simplest algorithm that we can have, is what is the average for a given individual of those 3 scores? Is it greater than medium or lower than medium? If it is greater than medium, then this decision cube is providing a good rationale to accept the vaccine. So, for example, high age, high illness, high levels of trust would lead someone to say yes. On the other hand, if the average of these 3 scores is less than medium, this would be perhaps a good rationale to decline the vaccine. Low age, low illness, low values of trust. But for each individual, it will be a much more interesting combination of these 3 factors. So what we can do is have a look at some examples, and these are fictional characters that I've invented for the purposes of illustration. So meet Susan. She is a lady in her 70s. She suffers from high blood pressure, and she is a little bit skeptical of the government. I challenge you to meet anyone in their 70s who is not a little bit skeptical of the government. Now, her age score is high, and we can represent that on the decision cube by an arrow that's quite high along the age axis. With high blood pressure, I think we can say that her illness score is medium, so we go along the illness axis into the screen, into the page, sort of halfway. And being somewhat skeptical, that's a trust score that's also, I would say, about medium. So we go about halfway up the cube, and we see where we end up. And you can see that the average of these three measures is greater than medium. And I'm representing this average of medium in the diagrams by this orange plane that slices across the cube. And if you had a purely medium value of all of these three measures, you would be sitting on that orange plane. But Susan, she lies well above that plane. Her score is greater than medium, and so the cube is giving a tentative yes for accepting the vaccine. I'm always going to say tentative because, again, the cube informs the decision. It does not make the decision. Susan will have other criteria that she needs to take into consideration before making her decision. Now here is Tom. Tom is a teenager. He has no known health conditions. He's very trusting of institutions. Being in his late teens, his age score is low, so we only go a short way along the age axis. He has no known health conditions, so his illness score is also low. And finally, he's very trusting of institutions, so his trust score is high. But what you see is that in Tom's case, the average of his three scores of low, low and high is less than medium. So the decision cube would give a tentative no that Tom or Tom's family would in his case decline the vaccine. The fact that he's young means he has a very low risk of serious outcomes from COVID, and the fact that he has no known health conditions also leads to that conclusion. Now meet Frank. Frank is a gentleman in his late 60s. Sadly, he suffers from severe heart disease. He's very, very skeptical of the information that he's received about COVID and the vaccine. The fact that Frank is in his late 60s means that his age score is high. The fact that he suffers from heart disease means that his illness score, sadly, is also high. And the fact that he's very deeply skeptical means that his trust score is low. So Frank actually ends up over here, and you see that the average of those three scores from the decision cube is greater than medium. So despite Frank's great skepticism, the cube would give a tentative yes that he should accept the vaccine because of his age and his poor health. Now here's Mary. Mary is a woman in her middle age. She has no known chronic health conditions. She is relatively skeptical of experts, as she calls them. So her age score is medium. The fact that she has no known chronic health conditions would put her illness score as low. And she is fairly skeptical of experts, so we would probably say that her trust score is about medium there. And we see that the average of Mary's three scores puts her below medium. So despite being middle-aged, given her good health and her medium levels of trust, she would be a tentative no from the decision cube that for the time being, thank you very much, she will decline the vaccine. And the fifth and final character that we're meeting here is David. David is in his 40s, a relatively young gentleman. Sadly though, he suffers and always has done from severe asthma. He's also someone, a bit like Frank, who is very, very skeptical of the information he's received about COVID and the vaccine. The fact that he's in his early 40s means that his age score is medium. Now, his severe asthma, though, I think because it's a lung condition, puts his illness score as high regarding COVID. And the fact that he's very skeptical means that his trust score is low. And this is an interesting case because actually here the decision cube is relatively uninformative because the average of his 3 scores is itself medium. So the decision cube is not giving a tentative yes or a tentative no. And in David's case, he will need to talk to his family and his doctor, take into consideration other important factors before he's able really to reach a decision. So finally, a quick summary of the vaccine decision cube. As you can see, each individual sits somewhere within the vaccine decision cube. We met Susan and Tom, Frank, Mary and David, and for these 3 given criteria of age, illness and trust, the vaccine decision cube gave different outcomes. And again, these are informing their individual decisions about whether to accept or decline the vaccine. Now, this approach can be extended to include more than 3 criteria, although you can't represent it in a 3-dimensional cube anymore. You'd have to use some other pictorial representation. But the very easy thing to do would simply to make an average of low, medium and high scores for the additional factors that you want to introduce. You could introduce additional individual factors or societal factors, and that's something that I haven't talked about in this presentation. Additional individual factors may be things like a person's immune health, whether they think they may have had prior infection of COVID. What is that individual's level of anxiety or their tolerance of risk? These are important things that would affect their decision to accept or decline the vaccine. There are, of course, important societal factors too. Does an individual have very close proximity to vulnerable individuals? This, of course, would influence their decision to accept the vaccine. What is their current exposure to COVID? Do they live in the middle of London or do they live in the Outer Hebrides? This, again, would be another useful input for an individual. So, as a final reminder, and I've said this many times because it is very important, this vaccine decision cube is a qualitative aid for reaching a very difficult decision for some individuals, should they or should they not accept the COVID vaccine. It informs the decision, it does not give that decision. This must be arrived at with input from other trusted sources, most importantly, a given individual's doctor. As a final word, I think it's only fair that I tell you what my decision was on the COVID-19 vaccine that I was offered last spring. My profile within the vaccine decision cube is medium age, low illness, and I would say medium levels of trust. A bit like Mary that we saw earlier on. And on this basis, I declined the vaccine. But it is a decision that I keep under constant review, and I do expect in time that I will actually take the vaccine once I decide for myself that the benefits outweigh the risks. Thank you very much, and I will see you next time.